The night was cold, but as soon as my eyes met his, the warmth that spread through my chest was undeniable. It was as if the universe had paused just for that moment. I didn't understand it then, but I felt it, something raw and powerful. Something that made my heart race and my thoughts scatter. At that moment, I knew this was the beginning of something I couldn't run from, no matter how hard I tried. I had always been the kind of person who kept my emotions close, who avoided vulnerability at all costs. Growing up in a world where any deviation from the norm was met with scorn and judgment, I had learned early on to hide parts of myself. I had kept my feelings buried, fearful of what would happen if I allowed myself to truly experience them. But when he walked into my life, everything changed. Sitting in the dim light of my room, I found myself thinking back to that very first encounter. His presence had shaken me in a way I couldn't put into words. He wasn't just a stranger, nor was he someone I could easily forget. In his eyes, I saw something familiar, something that echoed my own hidden desires. But it wasn't just physical attraction. There was a pull that went beyond the surface, something I couldn't ignore, even if I tried. The room around me felt too quiet as I wrestled with my emotions. There was a part of me that was terrified, afraid of what these feelings could mean, afraid of the potential rejection. And yet, there was another part of me, a part that I had hidden for so long, that wanted to reach out and tell him everything. How much I wanted to be near him, how much I cared about him in a way that went far beyond friendship. But would he feel the same? Could he? My heart ached at the thought of rejection. The idea of losing the friendship we had built, of seeing him walk away, was a fear that consumed me. I sat on the edge of the bed, my thoughts swirling, unsure of what to do with the emotions that seemed to intensify with every passing second. Could I open up? Could I trust him with this truth, even if it meant exposing a side of myself that I had kept hidden for so long? The uncertainty hung in the air, thick and suffocating, but it also carried a sense of urgency. Something was changing. I could feel it in the air, in the way he smiled at me, the way our conversations seemed to stretch on longer than they ever had before. But I still wasn't sure if I was ready to confront the truth of it all. Was this the moment that would define everything for me? Or would I let this fear win, and live with the question of, what if forever? The first few weeks of knowing him felt like an unfolding story. At first, I couldn't pinpoint why I felt so drawn to him. We were just two people, sharing a space, talking about everything and nothing in particular. But soon enough, his presence became a constant. It wasn't love at first sight, but it was something close, something deeper that I didn't quite have the words for. He wasn't the typical type I had expected to fall for, at least not at first glance. There was a quietness about him that intrigued me, an introspective air that made me wonder what was going on in his mind. He was often reserved, but when he did speak, it was always thoughtful. It was the little things that made him stand out. The way he laughed at my silly jokes or how he would listen, really listen, when I spoke about my day. There was something comforting about being around him, something that made the world seem a little quieter, a little easier to navigate. We spent most of our time in the same spaces, sometimes without even meaning to. We had our routine. I'd find him in the kitchen making tea while I was lost in a book. He'd come over to talk about something random, and suddenly we were deep into a conversation about our pasts or future hopes. What started as small talk soon morphed into shared moments of vulnerability. I told him things I hadn't told anyone before, about my fears, my doubts, the parts of myself I had kept hidden away for years. In return, he opened up about his own struggles, his childhood, his dreams. It was these moments, these simple, unguarded exchanges, that formed the core of our bond. But as our connection deepened, I began to notice something else, something I couldn't ignore. I started feeling more than just friendship toward him. There was a growing intensity in my chest whenever he smiled, a flutter I couldn't shake when our hands brushed accidentally. I would find myself replaying our conversations over and over in my mind, analyzing every word, every gesture. It was clear to me now, what I was feeling wasn't just a fleeting crush. It was something real, something meaningful. But it terrified me. I tried to convince myself that I was overthinking it. Maybe it was just a deep friendship, I told myself. But that didn't explain the heat that rose in my chest when he looked at me, the electricity that sparked when our fingers touched. It didn't explain why I found myself staring at him across the room, caught in a moment of wondering what it would be like to kiss him, to be with him in a way that went beyond mere friendship. I couldn't deny that there was an unspoken bond between us, one that felt both comforting and terrifying at the same time.
But what did it all mean?
Was I just projecting my feelings onto him, or was there something more? What if he didn't feel the same? I was so used to hiding parts of myself, suppressing my emotions for fear of rejection, that the thought of exposing them felt impossible. It wasn't just about me anymore. There was something about him, something in the way he held himself, that made me wonder if he, too, was struggling with his own feelings. There were moments, fleeting but undeniable, when I could sense the tension in the air, the awkward silences that followed a lingering glance or the nervous laugh after a touch that lasted just a second too long. But despite all of that, neither of us had said anything. We were both stuck, each unsure of how to proceed. There were times when I wanted to reach out, to tell him what I was feeling, but I would hold back. What if it ruined everything? What if it shattered the delicate balance we had worked so hard to build? My fears of rejection and of destroying the friendship kept me silent, but my feelings grew stronger every day. And in those moments of silence, when I was left alone with my thoughts, I felt the weight of the unspoken words between us. As time went on, the tension between us only seemed to grow. I started to notice things I hadn't before. The way he would glance at me when he thought I wasn't looking, the way his voice softened when he spoke to me, the subtle but telling smile he gave me when we shared a joke. These little things began to chip away at the walls I had built around myself, forcing me to confront the truth of my feelings. But it wasn't just the subtle signs that confused me, it was the way I felt when I was around him. I felt seen, understood, in a way I had never felt with anyone else. He wasn't perfect, far from it, but the way he made me feel was something I couldn't ignore. There was an honesty between us, a connection that felt raw and real, yet delicate, as if it could slip away if I wasn't careful. There were moments of doubt, moments when I questioned everything. Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? Was I reading too much into things? But then, there were other moments, those fleeting seconds where our gazes met and held, where words failed and everything else seemed to fall away. In those moments, the answer was clear. My feelings for him were real, undeniable. But still, I hesitated. How could I put myself out there, knowing that it might lead to heartache? How could I risk losing the one person who made me feel like I could finally be myself? And yet, despite the fear and uncertainty, there was a part of me that knew I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when my heart was screaming for something more. As the days turned into weeks, something between us changed, slowly but inevitably. It wasn't something that could be pinpointed with any exact moment. It was more like a gradual shift, a slow transformation in the way we interacted. The line between friendship and something deeper became blurred, and I could no longer ignore the pull I felt whenever he was near. My heart raced at the sound of his voice, my thoughts tangled whenever he smiled. I began to notice things I hadn't before, the subtle way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, the small touches that now seemed deliberate, not accidental. At first, it was so subtle I almost convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe I was just imagining things. But the more I observed, the more I saw the change in him as well. He seemed to be holding back in a way he hadn't before. There was a nervousness to him, a hesitancy in his movements, especially around me. His smile seemed a little more strained, his gaze lingering just a little too long before he turned away. I found myself questioning everything. Was it just me feeling this way, or was there something he wasn't saying too? The smallest of gestures, like his hand brushing against mine when we passed in the hallway, felt electrifying. Each time it happened, I could feel the static between us. And it wasn't just physical. The air seemed charged with something unspoken, something we both tried to ignore but couldn't escape. We would spend hours together, talking and laughing, but there was always a quiet tension in the background, a feeling that we were on the verge of something we were both afraid to confront. We began to spend more time together outside of our usual routines. The places we went to now felt different, more intimate, more meaningful. We started sharing more personal stories, letting the walls that had kept us at a distance slowly crumble. I told him about my past, about the things I had kept hidden from everyone, about the insecurities and fears that had shaped me. He listened in a way that made me feel understood, as if he saw me, all of me, for the first time. And in return, he shared parts of himself I hadn't known before, revealing glimpses of vulnerability that I hadn't expected. Still, despite the connection, there was a sense of hesitation between us. The dynamic had shifted, but neither of us was willing to acknowledge it openly. It was like we were both standing on the edge of something we weren't sure we were ready to face. I could feel the distance between us growing shorter, but at the same time, it felt like we were both afraid to close that final gap. The fear of rejection, the fear of ruining what we had, kept us both in a place of uncertainty. The turning point came one night, when we found ourselves alone in the apartment, the quietness between us louder than ever. I was sitting on the couch, my mind racing with all the things I hadn't said, and he was across from me, a look in his eyes that I couldn't decipher. It wasn't like any other evening, the usual comfort wasn't there. There was a tension hanging in the air, something palpable, and it made it impossible to ignore what was happening between us. For the first time, I could sense that he was aware of it too. I could see it in the way he looked at me, differently, as if he was seeing me for the first time, or maybe for the first time in a different light. My heart raced, my palms began to sweat.
Was this it?
Was this the moment when everything would come to a head? The silence stretched on, neither of us knowing what to say. I could feel the weight of my own feelings pressing down on me. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension, but my words were trapped in my throat. I was afraid that if I said the wrong thing, it would shatter everything. I could see that he was struggling too, his eyes darting away from mine, his lips pressed together as if trying to hold back something he couldn't quite put into words. But then, without warning, he broke the silence. His voice was softer than usual, almost hesitant. "Can we talk about something?" he asked, his eyes searching mine for a hint of reassurance. The question hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken possibilities. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest.
This was it.
This was the moment we had both been avoiding. He shifted slightly, his gaze never leaving mine, as if measuring whether or not he could trust me with whatever was on his mind. "I don't know how to say this," he began, his voice shaky, "but I've been feeling something. Something I can't ignore." His words were slow, carefully chosen, and I could hear the uncertainty in his tone. "I don't know if you feel the same, but I need to know." The breath I had been holding was released in a rush. I knew what he was saying, even though he hadn't fully said it. His feelings mirrored mine, the same confusion, the same intensity. And yet, even as he spoke, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The fear of rejection, of ruining everything, held me back. I wanted to tell him how I felt, but the words seemed stuck, unwilling to leave my mouth. "I feel it too," I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what it is, but
I feel it."
And just like that, everything shifted. The tension that had been building between us finally snapped. It was like we had been holding our breaths for so long, waiting for the other to say something, and now that we had both acknowledged what we were feeling, the weight of it seemed both liberating and terrifying. For a moment, we sat in silence, processing what had just happened. The world around us seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of us in the quiet, uncertain space between confession and action. There was so much unsaid, so many questions hanging in the air, but we were no longer pretending. We had acknowledged what we both knew deep down. Something was changing, and neither of us knew what that would mean for the future. The shift was undeniable now. We were no longer just two friends sharing time together. We were something more, but what that something was, neither of us could say for sure. But there was no going back now. Whatever happened next, we had crossed a line, and there was no telling what the consequences would be. But in that moment, in the quiet of our shared space, I felt a sense of relief.
No more pretending. No more hiding.
The truth was out there, and though it left us both in a state of uncertainty, it also opened the door to something new. Something neither of us was fully ready for, but something neither of us could deny anymore. The aftermath of our confession lingered in the air like an unresolved chord, a note hanging uncomfortably between us. For days, we avoided addressing the conversation again, allowing the tension to build with each passing hour. We had taken that first step, acknowledging what had been left unsaid for so long, but nothing felt resolved. The truth was out there, but it felt as if we were both still trying to navigate our way through the emotions that came with it. The weight of what we had revealed now hung heavily between us, and neither of us knew how to move forward. The silence that followed was almost worse than the uncertainty that had existed before. We were no longer in denial about our feelings, but we weren't certain how to handle them either. It seemed as if the words we had shared were both a release and a trap. The walls we had so carefully built around our emotions were no longer standing, but we were too afraid to let the floodgates open fully. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself standing by the window, looking out at the fading light. It felt as though the world outside was still while everything inside me was in turmoil. I could hear him in the other room, his footsteps light on the floor, the soft murmur of a song playing in the background. His presence was comforting, yet it only heightened the distance between us. We were so close, yet so far apart. The stillness was broken by a sudden knock at the door. I jumped slightly, startled by the unexpected interruption, and when I opened it, there he stood. His face was tense, his eyes guarded, yet there was something in his expression that I couldn't quite read. The usual warmth in his gaze had been replaced by something else, a flicker of doubt perhaps or fear. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice low, as though the words were hard to get out. I nodded, stepping aside to let him in, and as he entered, I could feel the change in the air. Something had shifted, again. The quiet tension from the past few days had been replaced by a sense of urgency. There was an unspoken understanding between us now. We could not continue to dance around what had happened. We needed to face it head-on, whether we were ready or not. We sat down, but the space between us felt enormous. He was still avoiding eye contact, his hands nervously clasped in his lap. I could feel my own heart racing, my hands clammy, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Was this it? Was this the moment where everything would come to a head? Or was it the moment where we would decide to walk away from the mess we had made? "Why haven't we talked about it?" he asked, his voice shaky with frustration. The question hung in the air, sharp and pointed. He was trying to understand why we hadn't addressed what was so obvious between us. I took a deep breath, my chest tight. "I don't know," I replied honestly. "It's complicated. We both know what we feel, but I think we're both afraid of what happens next." The words came out before I could stop them, raw and vulnerable. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, but avoiding it isn't helping either. I can't pretend anymore. I can't keep feeling this way and not acknowledge it. It's not fair to either of us." The weight of his words hit me, and I knew he was right. We couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay, that the shift in our dynamic hadn't meant something. There was too much at stake now, and avoiding the truth would only make it worse. "But what if it's too much?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What if it changes everything? What if we can't go back to the way things were before?" His gaze finally met mine, and for the first time in days, I saw the vulnerability in his eyes. "We can't go back," he said softly. "We've already changed. And maybe that's a good thing. But I need to know that you're willing to face it with me." The raw honesty in his voice made my chest tighten. His words were both a plea and a challenge, a question I didn't have an easy answer to. Was I ready to face the unknown? Could I handle the risk of losing everything we had by taking a step into something more? "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if I'm ready to take that leap. But I do know that I don't want to keep pretending that I don't feel the way I do. I can't pretend that this connection isn't real." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of our unspoken fears. We were both standing on the edge of something, unsure if we should step forward or pull back. The truth was, neither of us knew what would happen if we crossed that line. There were no guarantees, no assurances that things wouldn't fall apart. Finally, he stood up and took a step closer to me, his eyes searching mine. "I'm not asking for a guarantee," he said quietly. "I'm asking for a chance. A chance to see where this goes. A chance to not let fear control us." I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. His words hit me harder than I expected. He wasn't asking for certainty, he was asking for a leap of faith. He was asking for us to trust that what we felt was worth the risk. "I'm scared," I whispered, the words escaping before I could stop them. "I don't know if I can do this." He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from mine before he gently took it. "We don't have to have all the answers right now," he said softly. "But we can't keep living in the what-ifs. We can't keep waiting for the perfect moment that may never come. Sometimes, we just have to take that first step and trust that we'll figure it out along the way." There it was, the turning point. The moment where everything we had been avoiding could no longer be ignored. His hand in mine felt like a promise, one that neither of us could fully understand, but one that we were both willing to make. It was a promise of uncertainty, of vulnerability, and of embracing whatever came next, no matter how terrifying it might be. For the first time, I felt a flicker of hope in the midst of the fear. It wasn't the kind of hope that comes from certainty or answers, but the kind that comes from knowing that together, we could face whatever challenges lay ahead. "Okay," I said, my voice steady but quiet. "Okay, we'll figure it out. Together." And just like that, the emotional confrontation that had been building between us was finally over. It wasn't the resolution I had imagined. It wasn't the neat, clear-cut answer I had wanted.
But it was real.
It was messy, uncertain, and full of possibilities. And in that moment, that was enough. We didn't have to know where we were going, just that we were willing to go there together. And that, for now, was all that mattered. The days following our confrontation felt like a slow unraveling of everything I had known about us. At first, there was this fragile sense of optimism, the kind that comes when you've made a decision, when the tension has been released, and you think you've found your way. But that optimism soon gave way to uncertainty, as though we had taken that first step and immediately stumbled into an unknown path, unsure of what lay ahead. We had decided to move forward, to face the feelings we had been dancing around for so long. But now, it was clear that just because we had acknowledged the truth didn't mean everything would be easy. In fact, it only opened up a new set of challenges. We couldn't ignore the past, the complications, or the fear of the unknown that now seemed to follow us wherever we went. Our relationship had shifted, and though the air felt lighter in some ways, it was heavier in others. There was no immediate clarity, no magical solution to the tension between us. We could no longer pretend that everything was as it had been before. The dynamics had changed, and it seemed as though we were both trying to navigate that new reality. One afternoon, I found myself sitting in the quiet of our usual spot, a small cafe that had always been our haven. I stared out the window, watching people pass by, lost in my thoughts. The past few weeks had been a blur of awkward moments, half-conversations, and moments of intense silence. We had tried to reconnect, to rebuild, but it wasn't the same. There was an underlying unease that neither of us knew how to address. His voice broke through my reverie, soft but full of something unspoken.
"How are you feeling?" he asked.
It wasn't a casual question. It was deeper than that, a reflection of the same uncertainty that had settled between us. I turned to him, meeting his gaze. There was a question in his eyes, a desire to understand, but I wasn't sure I had an answer for him. "I don't know," I replied honestly. "It's complicated. I feel like we're both trying to find our footing again, but we don't really know where we stand." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, I feel that too. But I don't want to give up on this. I don't want to walk away from what we've built just because it's difficult." His words lingered in the air, and I could sense the vulnerability in them. He didn't have the answers either, but he was willing to keep going, to keep trying. That was something. The truth was, I didn't want to give up either. I had invested so much in what we had, in the connection that had brought us here. But the fear still lingered. Would we be able to move beyond this new layer of complexity? Could we rebuild what we once had, or were we destined to remain stuck in this place of uncertainty, forever oscillating between the past and the future? "We can't go back," I said softly, almost as if to myself. "But I don't know what's next." There it was, the core of it. We couldn't go back, no matter how much we might wish to. The past was gone, and now we had to face the consequences of our actions, the rawness of what we had opened up. But could we forge something new from that? Could we create something even stronger than what we had before? "I know," he said, his voice steady. "But I think we can still move forward, even if it's not the same. We just have to be honest with each other, and we have to be patient." Patience. It was something we had both struggled with, but it was clear now that it would be necessary. There was no quick fix, no immediate resolution. We had to let things unfold in their own time, allowing the emotional weight to settle and the new dynamics to take root. The road ahead wouldn't be smooth, and the fear of losing each other still hovered like a shadow, but there was a glimmer of hope, a sense that we could weather this storm together if we chose to. The days that followed were filled with small moments of progress, moments that spoke louder than any grand gesture or dramatic conversation. We learned to communicate differently, to be more honest about our feelings and needs, even when it was uncomfortable. We faced the awkwardness of the changes head-on, embracing the fact that there was no perfect solution, no return to the old ways. But just as quickly as things seemed to improve, there were setbacks. Moments when the old doubts resurfaced, when we questioned whether we had made the right decision or if we were just clinging to something that had already passed. The emotional confrontation we had had was still fresh in both of our minds, and sometimes it felt as though the rawness of that moment hadn't yet fully healed. Yet, there were also moments of connection, quiet, unspoken exchanges that spoke volumes. A touch, a shared look, a quiet understanding that we were still here, still trying. Those moments, fleeting as they were, gave me hope. They reminded me that even in the midst of uncertainty, there was something worth fighting for. But as much as I longed for a clear resolution, part of me understood that this wasn't going to be a neat, tidy ending. There were no guarantees, no promises that everything would work out. Life wasn't a story that could be wrapped up with a bow, and sometimes, the best we could do was take it one step at a time. We were two people trying to rebuild, to move forward, but not without acknowledging that the past had shaped us, and the future was unknown. As I sat there with him, in the quiet after our conversation, I realized that maybe that was the closure we needed. Not an answer or a resolution, but the recognition that we didn't need to have everything figured out. Sometimes, the uncertainty itself could be part of the process. The openness to whatever came next, whether it was together or apart, was enough. We didn't have to know exactly what the future held, but we could face it with honesty, patience, and the willingness to continue. Maybe we didn't have a perfect resolution, but we had something more important, the choice to keep moving forward, one step at a time, in whatever direction that might take us. And that, I realized, was enough for now.